And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Michelle Johnson, someone who will challenge us to honor the fullness of each and every human being. Michelle Johnson is a public scholar and a social activist. Her formal education includes a BA in Humanities from Michigan State University in English, philosophy, psychology, and women's studies, and a PhD in American culture in African American literature, 19th century American literature, and environmental history. Centering the power of telling story, she consults on Black history projects that document the people, narratives, and places of Black autonomy. And she researches, writes, curates, develops exhibits, performs, and lectures for academic and public settings. Black Latinidad and indigenous spatial self-determination, she argues, rests at the core of liberation and shapes rich and instructive narratives of our Kalamazoo identities. She has collaborated creatively with poets, musicians, and playwrights. You can read more about Michelle Johnson in the February 2021 issue of Encore magazine, and she graces the cover of that magazine. Today, she will discuss the Kalamazoo Truth, Racial Healing and Transformations Historical and Cultural Landscape Project and highlight Kalamazoo County locations with significant layers of cultural empowerment. Dr. Johnson.
Great, thank you. So wonderful to be here with everyone today, and honored to be asked to join you for your regular gathering, and just really thank you so much for giving some space to these ideas and the project that we're working on. And also I'm so appreciative for the opening of the acknowledgement of the ancestors. And so in that light, it's really important for me to acknowledge my ancestors, especially my Kalamazoo ancestors, my father, Roy Merricks, and my grandmother, Anna B. Cheney, who moved to Kalamazoo in the 1920s from Natchez, Mississippi, the first of her family to move there relatively young. And then her sisters and her brothers moved to Kalamazoo. So those roots in place on Crum Street in Kalamazoo are so significant. And so again, to both those ancestors and my mother, who this month will be the anniversary of her 2-year passing, Susan Tayo Van Hollen Rallier. So to them and so many more of my ancestors, I owe my presence here to them. So thank you for invoking that component of this gathering. So I am so excited to talk about this project, but to talk about something that I've been thinking deeply about for decades now. Sometimes when, as you advance in maturity, it's kind of daunting sometimes to think about how long an idea, how long a commitment has actually been at our centers. And for me, preparing for today's conversation did just that. It reminded me how for decades now, I've been thinking about the relationship between liberation and cultural autonomy, but especially thinking about the connection between those ideas and experiences and space and place. My dissertation was around relationships that Black people had to the natural world and an environmental cultural ethic that emerged out of that. And so from my upbringing in Saginaw and Kalamazoo, questions of space and place became very prominent in my mind. And through my educational process also in Michigan, the ways in which our experiences have been shaped by space and place became kind of quantified and qualified for me, but very much rooted in my own experience and my lifelong fascination with the experience of my ancestors, both biologically, by blood, but also by spirit. And so when we think about that and we start to think about the questions of liberation, it becomes really integral to first start thinking about what kind of space is designated, especially now we mentioned that my focus is Black history, particularly Black history in Michigan, but also the region, the Midwest region. But if space is designated to us, that's sometimes the first question. And even like recognizing the problematic paradigm of designation, right? Because that doesn't necessarily mean that folks are being able to oftentimes claim space for themselves as Black people, but are allocated space. So what kind of space is allocated? Is space allocated? Where is it allocated? Oftentimes those spaces and places for Black people have not necessarily been seen as the desirable locations at the time. Real estate shifts and then they sometimes become desirable. But quite often, where is that space? In Kalamazoo, there was the Bottoms, for instance, on the west side of the Kalamazoo River. On the east side of the Kalamazoo River was what they called the Lower East Side, but also floodplain, for instance. And so quite often, some of you might be familiar with Toni Morrison's work, particularly her work Sula, where she discusses the importance of space and place and the ways in which space that is previously deemed undesirable then becomes desirable and then becomes overtaken by a new ethic, or maybe the old ethic, but a new shift in what is deemed as desirable and valuable. But we have that same trajectory, that same experience here in Michigan. And so in addition to thinking about what kind of spaces and places have been designated for Black people over time, from the South to the North, and quite often, I need to say this too, because we quite often think about that there's this South-North trajectory, but it's so important to think of in Michigan about how sometimes they're very simultaneous trajectories, so that while things are happening for Black folks in Mississippi and Louisiana in the 1840s, simultaneously, they're happening here in Michigan for us. Different relationships to slavery, but sometimes not all the time, but I digress a little bit. But in addition to thinking about these kind of external ways in which people have allocated or determined space for Black people's experiences, whether those are oppressive, confining boundaries, or have some kind of permeability that folks have been able to work within kind of circumscribed space, but also be able to work outside of those confinements. What has always been and continues to be at a central level of importance is what we do with those spaces. What kind of cultural and community and economic ethics and practices have Black people been generating in those spaces, regardless of if they've been relegated to those spaces or they've chose those spaces? What kinds of cultural self-expression emerges out of spaces that Black people and as well as other folks, Latinidad folks and the wide range of indigenous communities, what do we create inside that? And what do we create inside that that then blends out into the larger world, but also retains a sense of cultural autonomy amongst itself? And those of you who've heard me speak know that I feel very strongly about that. And then there's the place where it starts to get a little edgy sometimes is where what do we create within those communities, but then what is the community response to it? Sometimes it's acceptance, but we also know that quite often when we pan through our history as Black people, as American people here, those spaces of cultural autonomy are often threatening to the culture that seeks to dominate. So we have so many, I mean, it's endless, and we want to uplift today, but I'll urge you to think about places like Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Paradise Valley, the Black Bottoms in Detroit, 6th Street and Wadsworth in Saginaw, all the places that there have been very strong histories of Black cultural autonomy that then, in part, my argument is, and other people's as well, that when that rise of empowerment, that rise of cultural self-determination started to reach a very strong place, then those are the times that people came for those places, that they ran a highway through, they expanded their university. But that's kind of another story, but also integrally connected to this conversation that we're having, because those places of cultural empowerment oftentimes become places of threat, and places that then people shift the narrative to call them ghettos, to call them places that folks wouldn't necessarily choose to live in. We think about redlining quite often right now, and while the restrictions on Black people from being able to move from places like the East Side and North Side are very important. At the same time, we also have to pay attention to what kind of restrictions or what kind of issues Black people were facing when they tried to choose to live in their own communities. But I will, again, I've got so many places I could digress, but I'm especially interested in those places of cultural autonomy where we see an insistence on family and community and freedom and autonomy and creativity and joy and liberation. And so in Southwest Michigan, we have so many examples of places where Black people have secured and maintained and insisted and having this constant relationship with cultural autonomy. And when we think about those places, and when we think about those people in those times, it becomes integral for us to refresh our landscape memory and the narratives that imbue particular places. So there are so many places just in Southwest Michigan. I mean, how many, I can't necessarily see everyone's hands, but I can imagine how many people associate Marshall, Michigan, for instance, with Black experience. Some of you might know the Crosswhite incident, and I'll talk about it a little bit, but this is a place, Paw Paw, Van Buren County, Allegan County. None of these places are places that immediately we think of as having rooted Black experience, but in fact they do. And in some cases go back, like in Marshall, Michigan, to the 1840s. And so it's imperative for us to go back. People ask me why I'm so fascinated with the 19th century. It's particularly someone who's lived through the 60s and at this point now lived through 2020, man. But the 19th century raised all of the questions that in many ways we have yet to answer. And they raised many of the problems and the pitfalls that we have fallen into over time. But the 19th century also represents many of the solutions, the liberatory tools that, for me, the past holds. And so when we think about Michigan, and I want to talk broadly first about Southwest Michigan, just with some kind of punctuated moments to understand how Black people over time and deeply rooted have engaged space and place and insisted on their freedom, insisted on their liberation in those spaces and places. And so many of you probably know, or some of you probably know, about the very rich history in Calhoun County. Many of you probably know that Sojourner Truth lived out the end of her life there, and a good chunk of her life there, both in Calhoun and in Battle Creek, and in the land that they established, Harmonia, as an alternate community just outside of Battle Creek, near where Fort Custer is now. And so Battle Creek has a very, very strong history, but Marshall, Michigan is also significant. And I will just try to give the briefest ever explanation of some of the really critical places of space and place and liberation in Calhoun County and Marshall. 1848, the Crosswhites, Adam, Sarah Crosswhite and their children had been living in Marshall for 4 years at that point. They had escaped from Kentucky from a man named Francis Giltner and lived there farming, living amongst other Black people who had escaped to Calhoun County into Marshall, and were living there, going about their lives. Really early in the morning in January, Giltner and a host of other folks who actually believe that they can own someone. You'll never hear me say slave owners. You'll rarely hear me say slave. I always think about people as enslaved and in a condition. But the people who really believed that you could own someone came and tried to recapture the Crosswhites and to take them back into slavery. The Crosswhites individually resisted Adam and his wife, Sarah. Adam, believing still in the judicial system, left his home and went to town to try to seek legal restrictions against the folks who were breaking into his home as he saw it. Sarah Crosswhite didn't necessarily believe in the judicial system. She refused to leave her home, but she also refused to leave her home to go back into slavery, to go back with David Giltner, Francis Giltner's son. David Giltner sat down and cried. He was so upset that somehow he was going to not be, I'm imagining right now that he wasn't going to live up to his father's expectations, but also he had made a trip from Kentucky to try to recapture these folks. And Sarah Crosswhite told him, no, I'm not going. You've had the best years of my service at your hands, and I am going to live out the rest of my life with my children. And so simultaneously, Black folks from around the community, people who had escaped from slavery, people like Planter Moss, for instance, and Nancy Stevens, came to their assistance first and refused to let them be taken back. They came with clubs, they came with guns, they came with fists, refusing to let them be taken. Then the white community of Marshall came, and by various accounts, there were 100 to 200 people, which is quite an impressive task given the size of Marshall even then, even now actually, came together threatening the Kentuckians and ultimately having them incarcerated, and the Crosswhites getting away first to Jackson, then to Detroit, and then to Ontario, to Chatham. And so what's compelling about that is this is a space where we don't typically think about Black experience. We certainly don't think about Black experience in relationships to space and folks insisting on their place there. We don't necessarily think about large numbers of Black people creating churches and creating cohesive communities that could respond so strongly to an offense and an attack on liberation. And so what's also compelling about that is a couple of the people that were there in Calhoun County, but especially Planter Moss, who was there, who was one of the first responders in this case to the event, had also passed through Cass County. So our southwestern neighbor from Kalamazoo, Cass County, also another very significant location of cultural autonomy for Black people, people who had escaped from slavery and set up spaces, but also people that were 2 and 3 generations into their legal freedom that had come to Cass County to establish an agricultural life, to establish a life connected to other Black people's experiences, people coming from North Carolina, people coming from Virginia, and settling into an agricultural life that actually became quite exemplary Booker T. Washington, for, you know, people feel variously about Booker T. Washington, but Booker T. Washington, the 1915 Lincoln Jubilee, the folks that put together the Michigan Manual in 1950 saw this place as an integral part of our national trajectory of Black farming, and it's a very significant place. But also a place that people resisted slavery. They resisted attempts for folks to come to try to take them back into slavery. So these are like two significant regions of radical political activity that was integral to thinking about our relationship between space and place and liberation and activism. And so we in Kalamazoo, we're kind of surrounded by some radicalism, and those levels of radicalism are not pieces that we saw in the early 19th century. In fact, we don't really see a larger number of Black people in Kalamazoo until 1860, though it's punctuated by experiences like the Nathan Thomas House, Nathan and Pamela Thomas House in Schoolcraft. But what I want to do now, because, you know, I can, you know, at first I was like, oh no, I got half an hour. I was going to do my stopwatch, and I've totally lost track of how long I've been talking. But I do want to talk specifically about Kalamazoo as a way to introduce our historical and cultural landscape project. So now I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that I'm going to be able to share my screen and you'll be able to see what I would like you to see. There are so many places in Kalamazoo that are these hubs of cultural empowerment, especially for Black people. And again, we're not only focusing on Black people, but for this today, because they wanted us to talk about Black history all month last month. I believe in talking about it all through the year. So I talked very little about it last month, in fact. But I do want to talk about Kalamazoo, and I do want to talk about those places of Black experience and those hubs of activity. And quite frequently we think about the North Side for so many good reasons, and that could be and should be a whole other talk. We talk about the East Side, again, for so many good reasons. We talk about the South Side for many good reasons, but I want to talk today, as we start to close this conversation out, by talking about a space that we don't typically associate with Black experience, with Black culture, with Black history. Because when you start thinking about how many sides of town Black history and Black experiences represents, when we think about it, it's every side of town in Kalamazoo. It's the East Side, it's the South Side, it's the North Side, and I want to add downtown to that. The West Side has a slightly more complicated experience, but also one that is worth exploring. But I want to think about downtown and to talk a little bit about downtown, because it's all that space is seen as a place that Black people either kind of passing through, or it's not necessarily a place that Black people live. And certainly today, there are very few businesses that we can point to for the expression of Black experience in downtown. So I think it's really integral and really important that we expand our lens or hone our lens in on downtown, and we can start to hone in on a couple of very specific places. Many of you know, the names I've seen and my understanding of the church is that many of you are rooted in history and many of you are rooted in activism. And so I think it's important to think about and to remember the political activity, and you know the political activity, of course, particularly even just the past in June of Bronson Park, and the history of protest and the history of resistance and insistence in that place. But what I want to talk a little bit about is another area, and that's a Kalamazoo Mall. Not necessarily a place that is typically associated with Black experience and Black cultural empowerment. But I want to bring your attention here to a little strip, right? You recognize the Kalamazoo Valley Museum, and the strip between on the either side of Eleanor. Some of that area now, as you can see, as you remember, we can't pass through there anymore. I am old enough to remember times when we could still pass through there. But I want to talk very briefly about Turn Vereen Hall, which was at what was 228 North Burdick, which now is kind of filled in and there's no building there. But in 1894, Black people in Kalamazoo put together a 1st of August celebration to commemorate the history of emancipation. Now this, by 1894, this was a very long tradition in Michigan. As early as 1839, Black people in Detroit, the colored citizens of Detroit, were already starting to put together celebrations of the emancipation of West Indian slavery. And so what's compelling about that, it's particularly when we have such an emphasis on Juneteenth, is that as early as the late 1830s here in Michigan, we were thinking about a diasporic relationship to freedom, a diasporic relationship to liberation, where other people were free and what that meant. And so by 1894, we had been having a number of different emancipation celebrations, and Kalamazoo was coming to Saginaw, and Saginaw was coming to Kalamazoo for these celebrations. Kalamazoo was going to Covert. This was a huge thing where folks were taking space, where they were parading down streets, where they were renting halls and public venues that had significance in the community to define what freedom meant for them. And so August 1st of 1894 in Kalamazoo, Black folks in Kalamazoo organized this event. Prominent people like Hiram Walker put together this project and brought folks from all over. Hopefully you can see, they brought Augustus Straker from Detroit. They brought J.C. Burroughs, A.H. Burroughs from Chicago, who was a major player in Chicago politics, and that brought, kind of brought big names, folks. And then I love that they had pleasure events and games such as bicycle race, tug of war, climbing a greasy pole. That sounds like fun to me. Running race and other races. And so there was a concert and a reception held at Turn Vereen Hall. Turn Vereen Hall was a space that had been, some of you may know, had been established by the German settlers in that area in the 1890s, 1881 rather. I'm sorry, 1894. Dates are 1881. Dates are not always my strength as a historian. But it established this as a cultural gathering place for German people. And Turn Vereen was a national phenomenon for German immigrants, but was a place that people rented out. And so the harmonic band of this, we learn about this in the Afro-American Journal and Directory. And so here we have Hiram Wilson, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of the organizers of the event, and Gilmore Phillips, who was one of the musicians, and the harmonic brass band of Kalamazoo that performed there and also performed in other places in the state. What's really important about this is up on the 3rd floor of this space actually then became became the location for 9 years for the Douglas Community Center. And so, or the Douglas Community Association. And so at that point, and if you can get the book, it's going to be coming out again. I'm so sorry that I didn't get my copy of it. Sonia Bernard Hollins has done a really beautiful job of collecting the history of the Douglas Community Center. And there's a nice section on the Turn Vereen Hall. But in 1919, the Douglas Community Association, after this history of the space being available and possible for Black people, then took over the 3rd floor of the Turn Vereen Hall and maintained and had daycare projects and other a host of other dances and activities for Black people in Kalamazoo from 1919 until 1928. And so these are pictures that I think are in the book, but are also, I give all the credit to Sydney Ellis, the executive director of the Douglas Community Center, and Sonia Bernard Hollins for finding these fabulous, fabulous photos. I have not been able to find an external view of the building, but we're going to put Matt Smith on that. But we're going to jump from 1928 to 1865, when one of the sources that is so integral and so important to me is the Focus News. And if you're interested in any kind of engagement, we need help going through the Focus News. But we see in August 19th of 1965, 3 stores, 2 that seem to at least be connected to Black experience or Black people, are opening up on, again, the Kalamazoo Mall, just right down the street where from Turin Vereen Hall was. Jay Moore opens up a record shop, and we also see the manager, Lawrence Henry, open up a BB's men's wear store on that same block. And so these are not stories that we necessarily think about, but also represent a very important element of Black cultural autonomy, economic autonomy, cultural autonomy, that folks are creating. They've got record stores, they're engaged. BB Menswear is said to have had a Michigan reach. We need to know more about this and about BB menswears and where other places were in Michigan. But we see a significant presence here in a place that we don't typically associate with Black experience, in a place that we all know is now in the process of a very significant amount of gentrification and reappropriation of space. And so some of that we see happening in 1970. And here I credit Jacob Johnson with finding this document. Many of you know Jacob and know that his history of activism in his family goes very far back to, is documented by 1915 in Kalamazoo. But his grandfather was the distribution manager for Focus News, which had extensive treatment of Black Latinidad and some indigenous experience in it. But as early as 1970, the Focus News that started in 1965, as early as 1970, folks like the Gilmore Brothers department store doesn't want these little Black children coming on the mall and selling the Focus News or passing on the Focus News. And so at the same time, we see this burgeoning again of some kind of autonomy, some kind of business rootedness and connection to culture that's happening for Black folks on the Kalamazoo Mall. That narrative is being, as you can see, banned on the Kalamazoo Mall. But then 1973, we have Fred Jones move. He's a longstanding Black businessman on the North Side, had a taxi service for a very long time, and I think 1 or 2 other nightclubs on the North Side before in 1973, he decided to move to this building on the Kalamazoo Mall at the corner. That would be the northeast corner of Eleanor and North Burdick. And so it had this business that was a very high-end Black business, brought folks from all over, from Chicago, from Detroit, from Grand Rapids, that focused on, you had to be dressed well, kind of drawing on the tradition, say for instance, of the Pacific Club on the East Side, particularly when that started to wane at that time as well. But focusing on a high-end, classy experience, also in the age of disco. So, you know, some of you might remember that was kind of classy, but you know, the disco music, never mind, I'm a DJ. But this space became an integral location for Black people in Kalamazoo, but also in regional experience and location. And so there you see there at the top of their 322, that location. And so how can I stop sharing is my screen stopped sharing? I think it is. So with the project, oh shoot, I did have one more for you. Let me see. There we go. With the Historical and Cultural Landscape Project, this is what we are invested in doing and have been engaged in for a little over a year now, is identifying places that are these locations of cultural empowerment, these places that tell these layered stories so that ultimately we can hand over that material to artists, to folks like Dr. Nelson, who's doing curriculum, to create new narratives or to resurrect old narratives, to be able to reimagine the landscape in ways that see folks not as victims, not as solely folks who have experienced outrageous oppressions, but that these spaces, when we reimagine them, when we revive these layers of experience that are in a particular place, it shifts our understanding and makes us see the ways in which Black people and Latinidad and Indigenous folks in the Kalamazoo area have shaped and sought to shape their own narratives and places. And by doing this project, what we hope to be able to do is create monuments and markers and curriculums and websites that help us all understand the layers of experience that are invisible to us right now. And it's particularly important that we do that at a time when we are losing so much space in Kalamazoo and across the country. So I thank you all for listening. I'm sure I probably went over my time and I apologize for that, but I look forward to more conversations. And if you're interested in being involved in this project, there is plenty of material to continue to gather.